No, you don't have to do that these days. I mean, there's something called UEFI. It's a unified extensible architecture for all BIOSes now. It's very easy to attack. It's a massive code base. It's at least as large as the Linux kernel itself. You can run your own video games in it if you want to. It has its own network stack. It's a giant operating system that nobody thinks about and looks at except for the bad guys. Hello, Scott Shefferman here, Principal Cyber Strategist at Eclypsium, the firmware security company. Listen, I was looking at all the news this week, and I thought it'd be worth a few minute segment here to just let this audience know that there's a lot going on when it comes to firmware in the news lately. And a lot of what you've been reading about actually is largely a firmware problem. If you think back to before the beginning of this crazy year we've already had, and you look at the discovery that we, along with Advanced Intelligence, did and the subsequent research into TrickBot's TrickBoot module, which is their new ability that's for that crimeware group to target the UEFI, the BIOS, if you will, on devices. That was an amazing discovery that caught a lot of people off guard. Why is the most notorious large, criminal group with, massive capability to develop even bother looking at firmware? Why are they bringing down an open source version of, read write everything driver, which allows an actor to do whatever they want to the firmware to the extent that they already have admin access? Well, we know TrickBot already has admin access on the box it's looking at, right? So with that in mind, let's talk about why these kind of actors are looking to firmware, and some of the recent examples actually just from this week alone that tell you why those reasons play out in the wild, in fact, right? So one of them is, well, let's actually look at this one that's big news today. Eclypsium is a device manufacturer. They make these FTA devices, which are now 20 years old, long in the tooth, if you will, but that device has been running this vulnerable firmware for quite some time. It was only recently patched. Unfortunately, that's let these criminal actors behind the ransomware group known as CLOP, which they're called that because they have their own version of ransomware called CLOP that's been very effective for them, right? Ironically, this same group changed all their TTPs and said, are you kidding me? I can just go to this one externally facing vulnerable device, take advantage of the vulnerabilities in the firmware and grab all the data because it's a large file transfer appliance. Yeah, they're not dumb. They're also very lazy, like any criminal mindset is. The shortest path to the greatest impact. So with that, they've gotten now probably over 100 victims recently reported by Bleeping Computer. They've been able to attack, and they've been, for some of the ones that aren't paying, they've been dumping the data like they threatened to do. So why set off ransomware in an environment that's noisy, it's hard, it's expensive, you got to move around, you got to live off the land, move laterally, privilege escalation, everything else you need to do to make that kind of thing pull off and extort an organization. And yes, that is still very effective. It makes them millions of dollars. In fact, TrickBot I just mentioned, I think they made over $150 million based on the research Vitali Kremez did last year on that same group, right? So it works, but why not take a shorter path for even greater impact if it's available to you? And this is what firmware presents to an attacker these days. I mean, it's the year 2021. This isn't, 12, 15 years ago when to target firmware, you had to know the platform you're landing on and come up with all these, this attack plan, and you had to be sophisticated and you had to know how to look at firmware. No, you don't have to do that these days. I mean, there's something called UEFI. It's a unified extensible architecture for all BIOSes now. It's very easy to attack. It's a massive code base. It's at least as large as the Linux kernel itself. You can run your own video games in it if you want to. It has its own network stack. It's a giant operating system that nobody thinks about and looks at except for the bad guys. And Eclypsium, of course, here. That's why I'm talking to you, right? So anyway, so with the Eclypsium FTA device, externally facing appliance, vulnerable firmware, hit that, grab all the data, and you extort the victim, right? So if you don't pay the amount they propose, then they will dox your data and expose it. Well, this just happened to a very well-known cyber organization that was using that same appliance. And don't need to mention the name; it's all over the news. But they have probably 19,000 customers, including supposedly, according to some accounts and by researchers, also their scan data. So this organization does vulnerability scanning, and now that data is on these these appliances, and allowing attackers to take a look at that. Now, whether it's current data, how much it is, how detailed those reports are they just exec summaries? I have no idea, but you get where I'm going. This has massive follow-on potential in terms of impact to those customers of that organization. And it all goes back to an attacker being able to use something like Census or anything else to find a vulnerable device on the internet, compromise it, see what you got, and then extort that organization. Again, firmware, shortest path, biggest impact. Just like TrickBot, if I can go to the UEFI and brick a device at the motherboard level, it's way more impact and leverage I have against the victim than trying to ransom an environment the hard way, right? And then another example in the news this week is the recent dump of the paid-for exploit pack called Immunity Canvas. Now that made the news because that's 800 plus exploits, and it's all automated, well documented, push button, script kiddie easy to use, very powerful curated exploits to attack a platform. That's why it costs money. And a lot of those exploits are either 0 days or what we call 1 days, recently known, probably still effective in the wild because not all organizations are patching, even if patch is available, right? So that was just leaked. And what made the news is, no surprise, a hardware vulnerability in the form of Spectre. If you guys remember back to 2018, the Spectre meltdown discovery was very impactful because it even forced chip manufacturers to go back to the drawing board and say, look, this balance between speed and performance and security, on the other hand, we need to get that right. We need to right size what that balance is, whatever that ratio looks like. And so that's resulted in much more secure hardware in the last several years. But if you're running a laptop, say 2015, maybe 2016, you're very likely vulnerable still to this particular exploit that was in this leaked exploit pack, right? And this should raise eyebrows, because if you remember back to the same era, 2015, when the Italian Hackers for Hire organization called Hacking Team was hacked by a vigilante hacker, and that hacker threw all those tools open on GitHub and made them open source. And those tools, like this one, they're very well documented, easy to use with SOPs and everything else you need as an attacker. One of the components in that tools was like vector EDK, vector/-EDK, and that was their ability to target the UEFI and implant it. And lo and behold, sure enough, the Mosaic regressor campaign that was also disclosed last year recently had been in the wild for 7 years before it was discovered. And those same actors were using, you guessed it, the same leaked exploit for the UEFI vulnerability from Hacking Team, right? So here we are again, fast forward another 5 or 6 years, and we have another paid for exploit pack that's got some firmware vulnerabilities in it. Now, there are other ones as well. If you grep through there, you'll find things, I think it's probably 290 megs or something that download for that kit from what I've heard. And if you grep through there, you'll find things related to other firmware vulnerabilities as well, in terms of like IoT, home routers. Maybe there's some Cisco stuff. I can't remember. There's a lot of stuff that's probably in there, because that's all the stuff that all the APTs and the criminals have been targeting for the last, ever since this kind of COVID new environment where we find ourselves in early spring of last year. All the attacks that were hitting all the VPN appliances remotely. That stuff's got to be in there, right? Because what do organizations want from a hacking kit and experience? They want to do APT replay attacks to say, am I vulnerable to the same thing I'm reading about in the news right now with a Pulse Secure or Citrix or a Cisco VPN device or an F5 device? All those appliances, all that vulnerable firmware that was externally facing all last year is coming to roost. So here we are, we're in 2021, we're a few months in, and as anybody who's in this industry knows, it's even more of a dumpster fire than 2020 was, and that seems to be impossible. But I mean, it's just one thing after another. And I just wanted to give you a few insights into what's going on with the firmware aspect of some of those developments, and then invite you, of course, to reach out to us anytime. We're friendly, we're easy to talk to. We can talk strategy, we can talk firmware visibility. We can talk firmware in terms of enterprise risk, firmware in terms of mission. If you're a federal client, for example, we love to have these conversations with you anytime. So thanks for listening. And this is Scott Shefferman, Principal Strategist, signing off from Eclypsium.